Thelma Catherine Ryan was born sometime in 1912 in the small mining town of Ely, Nevada. The nickname Pat was given to her by her father because of her birthday on the day before St. Patrick's Day. After her birth, the Ryan family moved to California, and in 1914 settled on the small truck farm in Artesia. She worked on the family farm and also at a local bank as a janitor and bookkeeper. Her mother died of cancer in 1924. After graduation from Excelsior High School in 1929, she attended Fullerton College. Determined to make something out of herself, she enrolled in 1931 at the University of Southern California, where she majored in merchandising. While she was enrolled, she started using the name Pat and occasionally Patricia instead of Thelma, but she did not legally change her name. In 1937, Pat Ryan graduated from USC with a Bachelor's of Science degree in merchandising, together with a certificate to teach at a high school level. Pat accepted a position as a high school teacher in Whittier, California. While in Whittier, California, Pat Ryan met Richard Nixon, a young lawyer who had recently graduated from the Duke University School of Law. He asked her to marry him the first night they went out. They eventually married on June 21st, 1940, at the Mission Inn in Riverside, California. Following a brief honeymoon in Mexico, the two lived in a small apartment in Whittier. As U.S. involvement in World War II began, the couple moved to Washington, D.C., with Richard taking a position as a lawyer for the Office of Price Administration. Pat worked as a secretary for the American Red Cross, but also qualified as a price analyst for the OPA. Richard then joined the United States Navy, and while he was stationed in San Francisco, she resumed work for the OPA as an economic analyst. Pat campaigned at her husband's side in 1946 when he entered politics and successfully ran for a seat in the United States House of Representatives. That same year, she gave birth to a daughter. Pat participated in the campaign by doing research on his opponent, incumbent Jerry Voorhees. Richard Nixon was elected in his first campaign to represent California's 12th Congressional District. During the next 6 years, Pat saw her husband move from the United States House of Representatives to the United States Senate, and then be nominated as Dwight D. Eisenhower's vice presidential candidate. During the presidential campaign of 1952, Pat Nixon's attitude towards politics changed when her husband was accused of accepting illegal campaign contributions. Pat encouraged him to fight the charges, and he did so by delivering the famed Checkers speech. In the 1960 election, Vice President Nixon ran for president of the United States against Democratic opponent Senator John F. Kennedy. We know how that went. Richard Nixon conceded the election to Kennedy. 6 years later, Richard Nixon ran again for the presidency. Pat was reluctant to face another campaign, her 8th since 1946. Richard Nixon made a political comeback with his narrow presidency victory in 1968 over Vice President Hubert Humphrey, and the country had a new First Lady. When considering ideas for a project as First Lady, Pat refused to do or be something simply to emulate her predecessor, Lady Bird Johnson. She decided to continue what she called personal diplomacy, which meant traveling and visiting people in other states and other nations. She was an advocate of the Domestic Volunteer Service Act of 1973. For her first Thanksgiving in the White House, Pat organized a meal for 225 senior citizens who did not have family. The following year, she invited wounded servicemen to a second annual Thanksgiving meal in the White House. Though presidents since George Washington had been issuing Thanksgiving proclamations, Pat became the only First Lady to issue one. The First Lady had long been irritated by the perception that the White House and access to the President and First Lady were exclusively for the wealthy and famous. She routinely came down from the family quarters to greet tourists, shake hands, sign autographs, and pose for photos. The tours that were conducted in December displayed the White House's Christmas decor. In addition, she instituted a series of performances by artists at the White House in varied American traditions. Among the guests were the Carpenters in 1972. She also oversaw the White House wedding of her daughter, Tricia, to Edward Ridley Finch Cox in 1971. After hearing about the Great Peruvian Earthquake of 1970, which causes an avalanche and additional destruction, Pat Nixon initiated a Volunteer America relief drive and flew to the country where she aided in taking relief supplies to earthquake victims. Her trip was heralded in newspapers around the world for her acts of compassion and disregard for her personal safety or comfort, and her presence was a direct boost in political relations. On the trip, the Peruvian government presented her with the Grand Cross of the Order of the Sun, the highest Peruvian distinction and the oldest such honor in the Americas. She became the first lady to visit Africa in 1972 on an 8-day journey to Ghana, Liberia, and the Ivory Coast. Upon arrival in Liberia, Pat was honored with a 19-gun salute, a tribute reserved only for the heads of government. She later donned a traditional native costume and danced with locals. She was awarded the Grand Cordon of Most Venerable Order of Knighthood, Liberia's highest honor. In Ghana, she again danced with local residents and addressed the nation's parliament. In the Ivory Coast, she was met by 250,000 people shouting, "Viva Madame Nixon!" Another notable journey was the Nixon's historic visit to the People's Republic of China in 1972. While President Nixon was in meetings, Pat toured through Peking in her red coat. She accompanied her husband to summit meetings in the Soviet Union later that year. Though security constraints left her unable to walk freely through the streets as she did in China, Pat was still able to visit with children and walk arm in arm with the Soviet First Lady, Victoria Brezhneva. At the time the Watergate scandal broke to the media, Pat barely noticed the reports of a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters. Once she did learn of the tapes, she vigorously opposed making them public and paired them to private love letters for one person alone. After President Nixon told his family he would resign the office of presidency, she replied, "But why?" On the morning of August 9th, in the East Room, Nixon gave a televised 20-minute farewell speech to the White House staff. The Nixons walked onto the South Lawn with Vice President Gerald Ford and Betty Ford. The outgoing president departed from the White House on Marine One. The helicopter transported them to Andrews Air Force Base. From there, they flew to California. After returning to San Clemente, California in 1974 and settling into the Nixons' home, La Casa Pacifica, Pat Nixon rarely appeared in public and only granted occasional interviews to the press. On July 7, 1976, at La Casa Pacifica, Pat suffered a stroke, which resulted in the paralysis of her entire left side. Physical therapy enabled her to eventually regain all movement, though. In 1979, she and her husband moved to a townhouse on East 65th Street in Manhattan, New York. They lived there only briefly, and in 1981 moved to a 6,000 square foot house in Saddle River, New Jersey. This gave the couple additional space and enabled them to be near their children and grandchildren. Pat, however, sustained another stroke in 1983 and 2 lung infections the following year. The Nixons moved to a gated complex in Park Ridge, New Jersey in 1991. Pat's health was failing and the house was smaller and contained an elevator. A heavy smoker most of her adult life, who nevertheless never allowed herself to be seen with a cigarette in public, she eventually endured bouts of oral cancer, emphysema, and ultimately lung cancer, which she was diagnosed in December of 1992 while hospitalized with respiratory problems. Pat Nixon died at her Park Ridge, New Jersey home at 5:45 a.m. on June 22, 1993, the day after her 53rd wedding anniversary. She was 81 years old. The funeral service took place on the grounds of the Richard Nixon Library in Yorba Linda on June 26, 1993. Speakers at the ceremony, including California Governor Pete Wilson, Kansas Senator Bob Dole, and the Reverend Dr. Billy Graham, eulogized the former First Lady. In addition to her husband and immediate family, former President Ronald Reagan and Gerald Ford and their wives, Nancy and Betty, were also in attendance. Lady Bird Johnson was unable to attend because she was in the hospital recovering from a stroke.